Imagine moving into a quiet neighborhood, thinking life would be peaceful, only to discover that one person was determined to make your world chaotic. That person was none other than the infamous HOA Karen, a neighbor who believed she could control every detail of my property, even though I never signed into her so-called new rules. At first, it was little things, complaints about where I parked, how my fence looked, or even what I planted in my backyard. I thought it was just typical neighborhood drama, the kind you brush off with a polite smile. But little did I know, things were about to spiral far beyond what I could have ever imagined. Karen didn't just want power, she wanted complete control. When I refused to bow down to her sudden rule changes, she became obsessed with teaching me a lesson. It started with harassment. Threats slipped into conversations, and endless complaints filed to anyone who would listen. Still, I stood my ground, knowing I had every right to my home and my freedom. But her obsession grew darker, and one shocking event changed everything forever. One night, in the very place where I felt safest, my own backyard sanctuary, trouble struck. My back house, the small space I had built with care and hard work, suddenly became the center of destruction. What happened next turned my quiet property dispute into a full-blown legal battle that grabbed everyone's attention. The damage was massive, the consequences even bigger, and the courtroom became the final stage where truth would clash with lies. The end result? Let's just say Karen's plan backfired in the most expensive way possible. But the story of how it all unraveled will leave you shocked. And it's only just beginning. When I first bought the property, I knew it wasn't in a formal HOA. That was one of the main reasons I chose it. I wanted peace, freedom, and the ability to live without someone constantly telling me what I could or couldn't do. But Karen, who had been living on the street for years, acted like the entire neighborhood was under her personal control. She introduced herself the very first week I moved in, carrying a thick binder she called Community Rules. At first, I thought it was just a quirky attempt to be neighborly. But soon, it became clear she wasn't just sharing information, she was demanding obedience. She started with small confrontations. One day, she knocked on my door, insisting my back house was not up to her standards. Another time, she complained that the paint color on my fence was too bright for the neighborhood's look. Each time, I politely reminded her that there was no official HOA agreement here, and I wasn't required to follow her binder of made-up rules. That simple fact seemed to drive her even more over the edge. Behind the scenes, Karen started rallying a few neighbors to her side. She spread rumors, whispered that I was a problem homeowner, and tried to push for a so-called vote to form a real HOA, which of course I never signed. Her energy shifted from annoying to unsettling. I could feel her watching whenever I worked in my yard. I noticed her taking photos of my property as if building a case. And then came the day she crossed the line. I never expected her frustration over rules and control to turn into something so extreme. What happened next changed my life forever and set the stage for a courtroom battle no one in the neighborhood saw coming. The tension reached a boiling point when Karen realized I wasn't going to bend to her so-called rules. She became louder, bolder, and more aggressive in her behavior. Every week there was a new confrontation, and every time I refused to give in, her anger seemed to grow. Neighbors began noticing the feud, and while some quietly sympathized with me, others avoided the situation entirely, afraid of being caught in her storm. It was no longer about property lines or paint colors. It was about power, and Karen wasn't willing to lose. I started keeping records of everything, notes, pictures, even voice recordings, because something told me I would need proof one day. And I was right. Karen's actions escalated in ways I couldn't have predicted. She filed complaints with city inspectors, all of which were dismissed because my permits and structures were fully legal. She even tried to get utility companies to check my back house, hoping they would find something wrong. Every failed attempt only seemed to push her further into obsession. There was also a strange subplot unfolding quietly in the background. One of my other neighbors pulled me aside one evening and whispered that Karen had tried similar tactics before. She had once targeted another family who refused to follow her binder of rules, and while they eventually moved away, it left behind tension that never fully disappeared. That revelation made me realize I wasn't just dealing with random anger. This was a long pattern of control, and I was simply the latest target. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The night everything changed wasn't just another argument or another complaint. It was an act that would turn our neighborhood drama into a headline-worthy legal battle with millions of dollars on the line. By the time the summer heat hit, the neighborhood had become a battlefield of whispered warnings and side glances. Karen's obsession with control was no longer subtle. She seemed to live for finding ways to provoke me. Every trip outside my house felt like walking into a storm. Her eyes followed me from across the street, and I started noticing strange things. Tools moved, small objects in my yard shifted, and eerie signs that someone had been near my back house when I wasn't home. The sense of being watched weighed on me, but I refused to leave. This was my property, my life, and I wasn't about to be bullied into submission. The days leading up to that night were tense. I had received passive-aggressive notes taped to my door, warning me about community standards and what would happen if I didn't comply. My friends and family urged me to report her behavior, but I worried it would only escalate matters. Karen seemed to thrive on conflict. Every interaction fueled her anger, turning ordinary disagreements into psychological games. Even local authorities had been called in before, but they couldn't do much. There were no formal rules I had violated, no official HOA agreement. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late in my back house, organizing my tools, when I noticed a strange flicker of light outside. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe headlights from a passing car, but something about it didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if the calm of the neighborhood had been replaced with an unspoken threat. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and saw signs that something was terribly wrong. It was in that moment I realized Karen's obsession had escalated far beyond intimidation. This was no longer about rules or control. It had become personal, and the consequences would be devastating. Everything I had done to protect my home, to stay calm and collected, was about to be tested in a way I never imagined. The quiet neighborhood had turned into the stage for a confrontation that would change both our lives forever. Just when I thought I had a handle on the situation, a second shock hit that no one saw coming. I discovered that Karen hadn't just been targeting me personally. She had been quietly manipulating others in the neighborhood to her advantage. A few neighbors who had seemed neutral until now suddenly started siding with her, offering advice, and even volunteering information that painted me as the troublemaker. It was as if she had been building an invisible network of influence, carefully orchestrating a narrative to isolate me. The betrayal stung because I had always trusted this community to be fair, and now it felt like the walls were closing in. The escalation didn't stop there. One morning, I received a call from my insurance company about suspicious activity on my property. Apparently, someone had tampered with my back house in ways that could have caused serious damage. That's when I realized the flickering light I saw the other night wasn't random. It was a warning, a test, a setup for something far more dangerous. My heart sank as I pieced together the truth. Karen had crossed from harassment into actual sabotage. Adding to the tension, a legal notice arrived, claiming I had violated newly enforced neighborhood rules. Of course, I had never agreed to these rules, but the paperwork was intimidating, and it made me realize Karen was willing to use every tool at her disposal, manipulation, lies, legal threats, to win. I knew then that this was no ordinary neighbor dispute. The stakes had gone beyond property disagreements. My safety, my livelihood, and my reputation were all at risk. As I prepared to confront this new reality, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. Karen's obsession had reached a dangerous peak, and the unfolding story was no longer just about rules or fences. It was about proving the truth, protecting my home, and facing the possibility that her next move could be catastrophic. The tension was unbearable, and the climax of this conflict was looming, closer than I ever expected. Once the dust settled, the courtroom became the place where everything unraveled. Karen's attempts to intimidate and manipulate the neighborhood were laid bare, and the evidence I had meticulously gathered, photos, recordings, witness statements, spoke louder than her lies. It was a tense process, but each piece of proof chipped away at her credibility, showing the judge and jury the full scope of her obsession and sabotage. What had started as a dispute over rules turned into a legal battle that highlighted the lengths some people will go to when consumed by control. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Karen was held responsible for the damages to my back house, the destruction she caused, and the emotional distress she had inflicted. The $1.2 million judgment was more than a number. It was validation that standing up for your rights, documenting the truth, and refusing to bow to harassment can pay off. Beyond the financial outcome, it was a statement to the neighborhood and to anyone watching. No one has the right to overstep boundaries and take control of your life. The aftermath brought relief, but also reflection. Neighbors who had been unsure now understood the importance of standing together, of respecting each other's property and privacy. The lessons were clear. Vigilance, preparedness, and patience matter when dealing with someone manipulative, and documenting conflicts can turn the tide in unexpected ways. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just a story about a property dispute. It was a story about resilience, courage, and the importance of standing your ground. Karen's actions may have threatened my peace, but they also forced me to act decisively, to protect what was mine, and to show that no one, not even an obsessive neighbor, can dictate your life. The neighborhood returned to calm, but the story serves as a reminder. Know your rights, stay alert, and never underestimate the power of standing up for yourself.